Hi. Thank you for attending today's reading. Let's begin. I've fallen off my bunk bed. I'm on top bunk just laying down browsing Reddit, and then I fall asleep. And next thing I know I wake up midair and I fell on the ground. The crazy thing is that I have these little rails that kind of keep me in but aren't easy to roll over. I don't know how or why, but that happened. End of story. Next story. Did anybody else stop at a Disney park in Georgia in 1980? In 1980 my parents had decided to take me to Disney World for the first time. I was 10 years old and my dad always meant well, but any opportunity he came across to save money he would. So flying would never have been an option, nor using a travel agency. He was solely going on a brief conversation that he had with someone at work where he needed just to take 95 south from New York, and eventually he would see road signs. My parents were both born in Russia and met in the United States in their early 20s. They tended to raise their voices and argue in Russian when they were frustrated. For the trip we were left the option open of driving straight through or stopping overnight somewhere. But knowing my dad, he would want to drive straight through to save the money. We left mid-July on a disgustingly hot early morning. Of course our Plymouth had no air conditioning. None of us had ever been further than New Jersey, so there was some excitement when we reached Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia. But by the time we hit North Carolina we were all miserable. The weather got hotter and hotter, and I wouldn't drink because my father would yell if we had to stop for any reason, even when he had to get gas. The both of my parents chained smoked the whole way, and my mother looked like she was about to have a nervous breakdown at any moment. I don't think my father truly considered the amount of driving the trip entailed. I could see him looking over the steering wheel in South Carolina, thinking that over the next hill Disney World would there. My mother never got her driver's license, and I knew my father was going to explode with frustration at any moment. I could see that intense look in his eyes in the rear-view mirror. That Route 95 and its blah scenery was wearing really thin on him. Eventually we made it to Georgia and we were all starving. With the limited Russian I could understand, I knew the yelling and screaming coming from both my parents were all curse words of regrets of taking the trip. Then my mother, at the corner of her eyes, said, "Oh, look at the sign for Disney." Quote, "It was like finding an oasis in a desert." Both of my parents' attitudes changed immediately. My dad then said, "The sign says take exit 15 towards Townsend." Then he massaged his chin like he was thinking about something. My mother then said, "We're in Florida, right?" Quote, my dad responded, "No, we're still in Georgia." Then my mother said, "Isn't Disney in Florida?" Quote, nothing would persuade my father, so he said, "Well, the New York Jets stadium is in New Jersey, so maybe it's the same thing." My dad got off the exit and we saw all the hand-painted Disney signs, which got us all excited. None of us really knew what to expect besides the limited magazine clippings we had seen in New York. We finally made it to the parking lot, which was just a big dirt open field. It was late after 7 p.m., so we figured that was the reason why the parking lot was so empty. The front gate had only one admission booth. The woman probably weighed close to 500 pounds and was smoking. She said in a real happy, cheery voice, "Hi folks, welcome to Disney. How many of you are joining us today?" Quote, my dad had a bit of a confused look on his face. So he looked around in all directions and then looked at the woman and said, "This is Disney World?" Quote, the woman replied, "That's right, sir, you made it to Disney. Is there 3 of you today?" Quote, my dad responded, "Yes." There's 3 of us. The first thing that we noticed was the park was mostly one big nature trail. There was no concrete and all of the structures were made up of wood. There were a few wooden buildings that lined the path when you first came into the park. The structures were supposed to resemble a main street. But there was a certain amount of flair missing from the hastily built structures. There was a souvenir store that sold nothing but handmade knick-knacks. There was a toy store that once again sold only wooden handmade pull toys from a bygone era. There were facade houses like a barbershop and a saloon. Then there was the restaurant. That sold backcountry food. Besides the women at the front gate, there was only one other employee we saw. He kind of watched us as we went from building to building. It didn't take long to figure out that he was also going to be our waiter, and we were pretty sure. The cook as well. We sat down at the restaurant. My dad had that disappointing look on his face, like this is nothing what he expected Disney World to be. But he wanted to be positive for his daughter's sake. The waiter, who was that same man in his 30s, was sweating profusely from trying to run everything by himself. He was wearing red pants with a white shirt. He was missing most of his teeth. He had longer hair on top and shorter hair on the sides. He handed each of us menus and then said he would be right back to take our orders. My parents unnecessarily took way too much time studying the menu, for there was only 3 things: fried alligator, spare ribs, cheeseburger. I really had no idea what was going through either of their minds as they gazed at the menus. Were they thinking we fled communism to have a daughter to have a supposedly unworldly experience for her and this is it? Or working 60 hours a week living in a cramped Brooklyn apartment and this is the best thing in life? At this point I was picking up the disappointed vibe in my parents, so I didn't want to complain about not having a kids menu. I ordered the cheeseburger and both of my parents ordered the alligator. The waiter didn't offer us anything, so I don't think they had anything else to drink besides water. The waiter brought us our food and we all ate. There wasn't joyness or sorrow in my parents' face. It was just kind of like blank stares while they ate their fried alligator. Eventually the path led to a creek that had something that looked like a castle. It was the only non-wooden structure in the park, which was made up of cinder blocks. It was 3 stories high and about 50 feet wide. I was more interested in my parents' response as they looked at the castle. They kind of were in like shock as they turned their heads side to side. I could tell they had an image in their head from Life magazine, and what they were looking at didn't match up. There was a castle turret that was formed by the cinder blocks, but the craftsmanship was equal to a bunch of high school kids who were paid $50 to hastily build something that looked like a castle. There was a crudely drawn wooden map next to the castle that showed that there was a path that continued to another circle path that eventually led back to the castle. We followed the path to the right. This was the quietest that I had ever seen my parents. They were just overwhelmed with disappointment. Most of the exhibits were poorly constructed wooden cutouts of Disney characters. We didn't even stop to look at them. By now it was getting dark out and my parents knew they weren't in Disney World. We didn't even want to finish going around the circle path. But my mother insisted because we were already here and paid the fee. My parents just assumed some type of lights would come on, but the more we walked the darker it got. At this point it was pitch dark outside and there were no lights on and zero moonlight. We still assumed some sort of lights would eventually turn on, but they just didn't. So my dad took out his cigarette lighter and he continually tried to light his lighter, but he was so frustrated that he wound up breaking it. The park was completely silent besides sounds of occasional wildlife. Living in New York City, we never heard these strange wildlife sources before. All we were familiar with was beeping horns, blaring music, and people yelling at each other. So none of us knew what creatures lurked in the deep forest of Georgia that were making these sounds. We didn't see any fencing enclosure to the park when we first came in. So alligators or anything else could be lurking at our feet unbeknownst to us. Both of my parents kept on making references to the movie, Deliverance, not knowing if we were unsuspecting prey and questioning why there were no other customers in the park. We just couldn't see and we would call out for help. We thought we were heading back towards the castle, but it was too dark to know for sure. My mother started crying and my father was holding my hand. As long as I held his hand, I felt okay. I could tell my father felt something wasn't right. Living in the city, we never encountered complete darkness. None of us knew, but we must have been slowly walking for 30 minutes. Our constant yells for help went unheard, we assumed, since nobody responded to us. We figured the two employees had split the money from us and had taken off for the night. We were constantly walking off the path to the point where my parents thought it might be safer to just camp out on the path for the night versus inadvertently drifting into the woods. None of us wanted to stay outside, but it was just pitch black and we had no idea where we were or where we were going. My dad figured that he could still create a dim spark with his lighter, so out of desperation he got on his knees and would continue to spark his lighter towards the ground where he could see the outline of the path. This process took hours, but we really had no other choice. My mother held onto his shirt and I held onto my mother's hand as my father crawled on the ground. My typical hot-headed father, who would yell if someone didn't turn on their car blinker fast enough, was absolutely calm crawling on the ground for what seemed like for hours. I really think he took responsibility for taking us to the wrong Disney, and didn't want to make it worse for me. Eventually we had made it back to the entrance of the park. The obese woman was long gone, but she had left a flashlight on the side of the admission stand. My dad turned the flashlight on and within minutes I heard him yell, "What the hell happened to my car?" Quote, "Someone had stolen our car and we were left alone in the parking lot in the middle of nowhere deep in the Georgia wilderness." My dad said, "I'm so sorry, sweetheart." Then we just sat on the ground until sunrise and eventually the heavy-set woman came in for the morning shift. My parents had no energy to argue and they just wanted to contact the local police. The obese woman didn't even have access to a phone at the park, so she had to go to her car and use her CB radio. Eventually the local sheriff arrived and his thick Southern accent and my dad's thick New York Russian accent was quite a scene. It was like they were from two different worlds when they interacted. The sheriff took a report of our stolen car and was telling my parents about the Disney park in Georgia. Apparently a local person who was a distant relative with the same last name as Disney decided to open the Disney, and not Disney World, park to mostly novelty seekers or unsuspecting tourists. The sheriff said the real Disney Corporation has a ton of lawsuits out on this park and will probably be forced to close as soon as today. The sheriff dropped us off at the bus station and we took 3 long bus rides back to New York. The one positive thing that came out of this misadventure was that I never heard my dad yell again. End of story. That is all for today. If you want to support my automated channel, feel free to drop a like and subscribe. See you tomorrow.